passages this morning came out of the lectionary, but ended up being surprisingly relevant for Martin Luther King Day, because it's a story about calling. It's a story about calling to do something very specific. So we want to walk through the Samuel story again to see what we learn. But we want to walk through the margins of the story rather than the main part. Because especially if you grew up in church, you sort of know the main part of the story. But when we retell the story, often we forget the edges of the story, which I always find to be the most interesting part of the story anyway. But before we can understand this story, we have to put it in its larger context. And it's sort of always tricky to do that in the Bible, because it's a story that begins with the creation of the world and ends at the end of the world. And there's sort of, like, where are you going to jump into the middle of a story? We want to jump into this one, actually in Exodus. All the way back in Exodus, right? The people of Israel are in slavery in Egypt. And God sends Moses and he takes them out of Egypt. Right? And then their first big stop, once they get out of Egypt and cross over the Red Sea, is to Mount Sinai, where God gives them the law. Right? So not just the Ten Commandments, but the whole law is revealed to Moses at Sinai, an ongoing series of revelations. And one of the things that Moses needs to do is he needs to build a tent for God. Everyone else is living in tents. God says, I want my own tent. I'm not going to live there because I'm sort of God and I don't do this whole live there kind of thing. But this is a place for my glory. So I want this to be a holy place. And I want you to set aside some specific people, and their job is to maintain the holiness of this space. To keep it, holy means separate, to keep it separate from everything else. So I'm going to take this special group of people, and I want to declare them to be separate, these priests, and I want them to be in charge of making sure they keep this tent thing holy. So then they make this tent, and the priests are dedicated, and away they go through the wilderness, and then they cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and they set up this tent in a place called Shiloh. And Shiloh is sort of in the middle of Israel, more or less, and that's the place that God's name dwells before the building of the temple in Jerusalem, a number of generations down the road. So that's where we are in the story. And Samuel, Eli seems to be the priest in charge of the whole tabernacle thing. And Samuel is sort of in training in some sense of the term. It's a bit tricky exactly what happens, right? But we all know the story of Samuel, right, Samuel's mom coming to the temple. Anyway, right? So Samuel is in training to maintain the holiness of the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is really holy. Right? Imagine that this is our tabernacle, except that in the Old Testament sense of tabernacle, only the priests get to enter the tabernacle. Right? So imagine you came to church on Sunday morning, but you have to stay up there in the foyer. I'm the only one allowed in here. But that's okay, right? Because you only come to church once a year anyway, which is about how often Samuel's parents came to the tabernacle, because let's face it, right? If the only church in West Virginia was in Charleston, and you didn't have a car, how often would you go to church? Maybe once a year you'd make it? Right? So it's a very different system. But it's still worth, I think, thinking about holiness. Thinking about holiness. And in the Old Testament, right, for a passage like this, the key is the holiness of the space. And I'm not sure about that one. Is this a holy space? I'm not very good at that. So, right, I mean, there's kids running around here, and I think that's great. Right? There have been kids somersaulting down the aisle here. I'm fine with that. Right? And we have, like, coffee for sale in the back. I don't know. Right? But yes, I do, because I put it there. Right? So I have difficulty with this idea of holy spaces, but fortunately for me, the New Testament has a different sense of holiness, and that is that the idea of holiness is transferred from the space and these special people called priests to us, to you. It is you who are the holy people, the chosen nation, set aside for God. Which is, I think, also relevant to our celebration of Martin Luther King's Day, because it's easy to celebrate Martin Luther King, because he was a great man, and he said great things, and he did great things, and then we can go home and continue on with our lives the way they are the rest of the time. Right? Just like in the old days, you could go to the tabernacle, right? Do your once-a-year celebration, right? Throw together a sacrifice, eat some meat, it's a good time, go home, continue your life. Pretty much the same way it's always been. But the New Testament says, no, that's not the way this system is supposed to work. Right? The work of God isn't maintaining the holiness of the space. It's somehow maintaining the holiness of the rest of your life. And that doesn't stop when you leave here. It doesn't stop Sunday afternoon. It doesn't stop once we hit 11 o'clock, then we're free to go. We've got this task that Jesus gave us, that Martin Luther King continued, that we are supposed to continue. So the margins of the story. Again, we all know the nice parts of the Samuel story, right? Samuel's family comes to the temple, and Samuel's mother says, oh, I don't have any children, and God says, I'll give you children, right? And that whole part. There's a couple of pieces in chapter 2, in 1 Samuel, we tend not to read. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. So Eli is in charge of the tabernacle, but the sons of Eli were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord or for the duty of the priests of the people. And so then it goes on to explain how, right, they had these rules of the way things were supposed to be done and their job and the things they were supposed to be done. They just didn't pay attention to any of it. They just did things the way they wanted to, and they wanted the best of everything. Chapter 2, verse 22 says, now Eli was very old. He heard that all his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. That's pretty bad. So the people of Israel are coming to this holy space, which is supposed to be maintained by these holy people, and they find that the holy people maintaining the holy space are worse than the rest of them. I think one of the reasons that we uphold Martin Luther King as a leader is because so much of the church is not well served by its leadership. That as we view the lives of so many church leaders, we see the lives of people who we shouldn't emulate. And it's worthwhile understanding how old that story is. How old that story is of leaders who are just in it for their own good. Who are just doing what they want to do and getting away with it because the people who are above them are doing nothing to stop them. And we don't have to look at the Catholic Church for that. We've got lots of that going on in our own denominations. And so we, once in a while, need to celebrate the fact that some of our leaders, mostly, even in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., mostly, right, walk the walk and not just talk the talk. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Does that sort of feel familiar? The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. It's important to understand that this Samuel story is not a paradigm. It's not sort of the way things usually work. I'm guessing that if it was, let's say I could say that to you, that like if you have a real problem, if you've got a question you need answered, or if you're trying to figure out direction for your life, all you need to do is come sleep in the church for a couple of nights. God's going to show up and tell you what to do. How many of you would come? That's all? I'm guessing we'd have a full sleepover here. Right? If I said to you, just come sleep in the church for a couple of nights, God will tell you what to do. Would you come, Will?
Sure.
Absolutely. I will lie down in my office and we can do the whole, right, Samuel thing, and then, right? This isn't the way things usually work. And God does call certain people, and the rest of us sort of stuck sometimes, trying to figure out the will of God. So it's important as we read this Samuel story to go, yeah, it's really, really good that we have these leaders once in a while. That we have the Martin Luther Kings who heard the call and responded to the call, because the rest of us don't get that. That's okay. And we see that also in chapter 3, verse 7. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. Samuel has been training to be in charge of the tabernacle, in some sense of the term, since he was 2. We don't know how old he was now, but he's been at this training for quite a while, doing the job, learning under Eli, and yet it says he does not know the Lord. But again, doesn't that feel familiar? Right? Most of you have been going to church for years and years and years and years. And yet if I asked you, do you really know God? What would you say? I think I'd say no. Do I know God? I know lots of things about God. Right? There's this phrase that goes around in some churches about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Do I have one of those? I don't know. It's not like, me and Jesus sit down for coffee regularly and talk about it. At least when I talk about stuff, I don't get a lot of ongoing response. Do I know God? And again, the story says, no, that's not natural. It's not assumed. It's not what we're supposed to be aiming for. There's a few people out there who get to know God, right? The Samuels and the Martin Luther Kings and the people like that. And the rest of us just have to muddle on. Hopefully we pay attention to those who do know God, and hopefully we can figure out at some point who does know God and who doesn't, because that's always a trick too. Right? But I don't want to stand up here and try to tell you that unless you know God, you don't make the cut here. I don't think that's given to us. What is given to us is tasks, right? Love, peace, working for justice, things like that. Right? Relationships are given to us. And part of that is some sort of relationship to God. But to know God, I still think that's a rare thing, and I think that's okay. And finally, this story ends in bad news. But really, the message that Samuel gets is about to kill Eli and his whole family. That's the message. It's not, oh, I am calling you, Samuel, to this great and glorious task, but go tell Eli he's about to die. And he's about to die because he deserves it. And Eli says, yeah, I deserve it. And Eli's sin is not that his sons have been doing all of these horrible things. Eli's sin is that his sons have been doing all these horrible things, and he's been doing nothing about it. Canada, they're doing all of this stuff, and he's just watching. Don't think it's my task to tell you how to live your lives. I do think, however, that it is your task to help each other. That when we see one another doing things that just shouldn't be done, there are ways of telling one another that we are accountable to each other in this community, for the good and for the bad. That God has given that holiness task to all of us. And so this also should be our response after the Martin Luther King celebrations are over. That this task that God gave Martin are now our tasks, because in case you haven't noticed, the job isn't quite done yet. We've just gone from a black president, which looked like things were heading in the right direction, to an overtly racist one. How did that happen? But it happened, and here we are. So the task is not finished. The task is still ours. Well, this is our challenge, not just for the week, but between now and next year's Martin Luther King celebration. To recognize that the task is unfinished. The task is ours. For us to respond, "Here am I, send me."